It's good to see everybody. This week hasn't been a very easy week, just for a variety of different reasons. But my family and I haven't been in the best of health, and it's just been kind of I think, the middle of any process is always the most difficult. Like I used to run track in school. And I remember I used to have to do the mile, and you do 4 laps around the track. And the hardest lap of those 4 is actually lap number 3, because it's the middle. You don't have the adrenaline of the start of the race. You don't have the adrenaline to try to get to the end of the race. That middle is where it's usually your slowest split comes in that third leg. And I think this last week it's kind of the middle. We're not excited as we were in week 1. We're not excited to get to the end like we are starting this week. And I think, that middle becomes extremely hard. And to me, I think, I don't see it being a coincidence that the week that we declared to speak on, to pray about families, to take a fast for our families, is the week that became a really difficult week. And I know my family wasn't the only one that went through various sicknesses. I know that some people aren't even able to be here today because them and their families are still struggling with various things. But I don't see it as a coincidence. I really do think that Satan takes it upon himself that when we devote time and prayer and fasting, specifically focusing on the health and the well-being and the spiritual strength of our families, I think Satan takes a special note of that. And I wanted, this verse came to mind, this passage came to mind out of the book of Job. And we know Job was an extraordinary man, a man who lived, one of the earliest individuals that's recorded in the Bible, but a man that was highlighted by God in front of all of his angels, in front of Satan himself, as the one man that Satan should pay attention to. And I wanted to note this one thing in verse 9 and 10. Satan speaks to God because God makes a special note to say, wait a second, I see that, you tell me that the whole world is yours, but have you noticed my servant Job? And listen to Satan's response. Verse 9, Job chapter 1, verse 9. And Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. Notice the order that Satan describes Job's blessing. He said, I'm going to reread verse 9 and 10. Then Satan answered the Lord and says, does not Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house? Satan sees Job's blessing as a blessing, first of all, on Job himself. But then he says, wait a second, not only have you protected him, but you've also protected his house. And then he goes on and lists all the sheep, all the cattle, all the possessions, money, wealth, you name it. But in Satan's eyes, the blessing on Job was him first, then the family, and all the rest of the stuff followed. Now, this is not just something that Satan points out. Notice how Job is described. Let's go to the very beginning of the chapter, Job chapter 1, verse 1. It says this, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, verse 1. Chapter 1, verse 1. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Verse 2. And there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. God also makes a note to say that Job was, first of all, an upright man. And I think that's a note to us that, first of all, we got to take care of our business. And I think there's a reason why we devoted week 1 to focusing on personal relationship with God and about, identifying certain problems or things in our lives to focus on. But then it says, and then there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. And then it goes on and lists all the sheep, all the cattle, and things like that. Our blessing includes, whether you're looking from Satan's perspective or from God's perspective, it's us and our families. Us and our families. And so for me, it wasn't that big of a surprise when I really thought about it. Why are we having such a difficult week? Why is it so hard with my fast this particular week? Because I think when we declare certain things in our lives about the health of our family, Satan takes a note. Because a strong family is also going to be a strong church. You yourself are going to find blessing. And not only that, but the strength of our family carries on a legacy beyond just me. beyond just me, because there's going to come a point in time when my life is going to come to a close. But guess who lives on? It's going to be my kids and their kids, and the legacy is going to live on. But Satan understands that. So I want this message to be, first of all, encouraging, but I also want to issue a little bit of a challenge to you guys, because I think there's a couple things that God has shown me out of the passages that I'm going to read today that I think we can all improve on. But I do want this to be an encouraging thing, because when we devote time to focusing on our families, Satan wants to battle with you. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I think if Satan doesn't touch you and he doesn't address any kind of arrows in your direction, that means you're doing exactly what he wants you to do, which is either sitting back, being lazy. I'm not quite sure what this is, but when Satan takes a note of you, he takes a note of you and your family. And I think we're in this spot now. And I wanted to start off, I'm going to look at two different books in the Bible here, two different individuals. But one is a person who kind of came back to me, even though I just recently touched on this particular example. But it's in the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah was a man, if you guys remember, who was a servant in a king in the court of a king by the name of Xerxes. Okay, so this is a man who was very powerful. He was a cupbearer. He would bring the wine to the king. So he had direct access to an extremely powerful king. And there was a point in time when Nehemiah, and just a little bit of history, the people of Israel had been exiled. They had been conquered due to sin. They had been taken captive. And Nehemiah finds himself, being a Jew, he found himself as a servant in this king's palace. And he gets word that the walls of Jerusalem have been destroyed, and that basically nothing is happening in Jerusalem, that the city that he had once counted his own, that was the pride of the people of Israel, has now been destroyed. And Jeremiah breaks down, and this is Nehemiah and Jeremiah. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 4. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 4. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and I wept, and I mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So here we have this immediate attention of Nehemiah. As soon as he realizes what the problem is and his heart begins to break, he immediately goes to prayer and fasting. And I wanted to kind of point out that if we are fasting and not spending time in prayer, we're doing something wrong. We're just starving ourselves, right? I think in Russian there's the golodota, or golodovka, something like that. There's a Russian word for that. You're just starving yourself. You're just going hungry for no reason. Because, one thing that Alex has pointed out over the last couple of weeks is that a fast isn't about trying to twist God's arm into doing something for you, right? There has to be, whenever you see fasting in the Bible, there's always this idea of prayer attached to it. And if we look at Matthew, very quickly, Matthew chapter 6, when Christ is speaking, and Christ makes three assumptions about the people of his believers. And he says, he gives these three things. Chapter 6 and verse 2, he says, when you give to the needy. It doesn't say if you give to the needy. Matthew chapter 6, verse 2. When you give to the needy, right? Don't do it in secret. Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. Okay? He says when you give, not if you give, when you give. So the assumption here is that we ought to be doing this. In the life of a believer, that's something you ought to be doing. Verse 5, chapter 6, verse 5. And when you pray. Okay? Point number 2. As a believer, the expectation is not if you pray, or sometimes when you pray. No, when you pray, do it like this. Don't be as the Pharisees. Don't pray as the Gentiles. Go into a quiet room, close the door, and pray to your Father in secret. And the last one, if we go to verse 16, it says, "And when you fast." When you fast, don't look gloomy. Put oil on your head. Look awake. Look alive. So these three things Christ highlights as being essential pieces of a believer's life. He doesn't separate them. He says when you give, when you pray, and when you fast. All of these things should be practiced in the life of a believer at some point in time. And so here we have in the book of Jeremiah, when he identified a problem, he begins to fast and pray. All right? And he begins to kind of bring his prayers to God. And then we know that Nehemiah, when he approaches the king, he's obviously looking very, very sad, because he realized that the city and the people that had once been the pride and once been, God's people who were kind of the show of blessing of God's hand upon them, these people were living as slaves. These people were, being killed off. These people had no city to call home. The temple was obviously destroyed. And the king sends for him and he says, "Why are you looking so down?" And Nehemiah begins to explain to him and says, "Look, how can I be happy? My people are exiles. The city is destroyed." And the king says, "What can I do for you?" And I want you, if I can remember, I'll try to come back to why was the king so willing to help Nehemiah. I'll try to touch on that point a little bit later. But Nehemiah has the boldness to say, "You know what, king? This is what's wrong. Okay? The city's broken. I want to go back. Can I go back?" And not only that, but Nehemiah says, "Can you send me some material too?" Right? Not only, so remember, these are slaves in his kingdom. And the king is now hearing from another slave saying, "I want to go back and rebuild that city wall, but I want you to fund me. I want you to send material." And guess what? The king says, "Sure." And the king sends Nehemiah, and the king says material, and Nehemiah goes off and he starts to build the wall. When Nehemiah shows up, and I'm skipping over here quickly, but when Nehemiah shows up at this particular city, the city wall is obviously destroyed. And Nehemiah does a circle around the wall, and he realizes what they need to do. And he comes across a man by the name of Sanballat. Now, I looked up what the name Sanballat means because he shows up for a very short period of time. And I was just curious because what this man starts to do is, first he starts to laugh. Look at these people. They're trying to rebuild a wall. Like, even this wall is so tiny that even the foxes and the rabbits and these wild animals can just jump over. And if these animals can do it, what's this going to do to an army? He laughs at him. He picks on him. And he kind of leaves him alone. But Nehemiah devotes his time, and him and his people, they start to put in the effort. They start to build up this wall. And all of a sudden, in chapter 4, and I forgot to tell you. So Sanballat actually means enemy in secret. Enemy in secret. There's maybe a parallel here where we think about, Satan, who also works in secret, right? He tries to sneak in. He tries to first of all ridicule you. He tries to make fun of you. He tries to pick at you. He tries to kind of nitpick all of these little details that maybe you're not doing right. He's trying to get you to stop doing your work. And Sanballat was doing the exact same thing to the people of Israel. Look at you people trying to build up this wall. This wall's nothing. And Satan might come to you today and say, look at you, look at your family. It's all destroyed. Look at your kids are walking away. Your job is going to ruin. Look at that. You're sick and you're tired all the time. He's trying to pick at you. He's trying to get you to stop. He's trying to get you to stop working. But Nehemiah, he had devoted his time to prayer and fasting, and the king, for some crazy reason, had let him go. And Nehemiah says, you know what? We're not going to worry about Sanballat. We're not going to worry about all these things that he's saying. We're going to continue to do our work. And guess what? In chapter 4, verse 1, Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "Now when Sanballat heard that they were building the wall, he was angry, and he was greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews." He started to get, now it wasn't just a game anymore. Now this wasn't just a bunch of random people trying to build up a wall that would never be built. Because all of a sudden, Sanballat realized that continuous work, continuous effort on rebuilding the wall was actually doing something. And so Sanballat starts to get angry. And he starts to focus some specific insults against the people of Israel. Verse 6, and Nehemiah is speaking again. He says, "And we built the wall, and all the wall was joined up to half of its height." And I don't know how high the walls of Jerusalem are, but I would assume they're maybe 6-10 feet high at this point. And so all of a sudden, Sanballat shows up again, and the walls are rising up. Little by little, they're coming up. Verse 7, "And when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were angry, and they plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and cause confusion of it." So Sanballat, again, this enemy in secret, that's what his name means. He begins to devise this secret plan. How can we go in there? How can we start to break this wall? How can we start to divide the people so that this wall does not get finished? Because suddenly, and Sanballat seems like he's kind of important. He's obviously not the king, because King Xerxes is still back in Persia somewhere, sitting on the throne. So he's not the equivalent of a king, but he's some kind of an official. He could be a governor or something that's supposed to watch that particular area. And Sanballat had everything under control until Nehemiah declares that this wall is going to come back up. And all of a sudden, Sanballat sees that his power in that region is a little bit shaky. And so he starts to devise some kind of a plan to try to undercut these Jews, trying to get them to stop doing their work, tries to get them to stop working. Now this is where Nehemiah steps in verse 9. And we prayed to our God, and we set a guard as a protection against them day and night. And this is something that I preached about a month or so ago, where there's two things that Nehemiah says. First of all, he goes to God. Why does he go to God? Well, first of all, we have to understand that at this particular point in time, the Jews have no army. They have no protection whatsoever. And here they are in the middle of a country that is no longer really their own, trying to rebuild something that's already been destroyed, and now they're getting threatened. And Nehemiah realized that if strength and protection does not come from above, we're not going to make it. And so he cries out to God. He realizes that I've done everything that I can possibly do, but I need additional help. I need God's help. I need God to step in. And so he declares that we're going to pray to our God. And the second thing is he set a guard. He set a guard. Now, in other translations, I think it says that they set a watch. Now, this is one thing that I focused on in the past, this idea where you have to identify weak points. Identify where they might come through, where the enemy, maybe the wall is the freshest, or it's the lowest, or maybe it's there's a hill or something where the enemy can walk over. They started to identify those points in the wall that could be broken. And I kind of wanted, as I was reading this over the last week, I wanted to kind of envision that the city that's being rebuilt here is my family. It's my family. And my family has its ups and downs. And I know I still have a young family, and our kids are growing, and we're trying different things, and we're not perfect. But as my family is growing, we are building up this wall, right, of protection around our family. We're telling them, we're teaching them, we're praying with them, we're guiding them, correcting them as much as we can, and we're slowly building up this wall. But there's an enemy lurking around trying to undercut my family, trying to make sure that the walls don't get built, trying at every opportunity to crush my kids, to try to teach them certain things that maybe I don't want. And I wanted to imagine that this is the walls of my family being built up into a strong family that could be an example, that could be like the city on a hill. And there's the Sanballat, there's a Satan who's walking around my walls looking for a weakness. And the Bible tells us we got to set a watch. I have to identify those problems. I have to identify those weak points. And what are those in your family? Is it you? Sometimes we show up in our families and we start, swinging our hands left and right. This isn't right. This isn't right. Why are these lights on? And why are you doing this? And why aren't you in bed yet? I get angry. Could it be something about a particular character quality in our lives or in the lives of our family? Are we maybe a little bit indifferent about what's happening in our family? We just don't care. Are we a little bit lazy sometimes? I know that I should be spending time with my family, with my kids, with my wife, devoting time with sitting down and actually teaching them like the Bible says to do, but I'm just too lazy. I've got too many other things to do. Is it pride? Is this idea that, I don't need to spend time with my family. My family's good. I'm a Christian person. God's going to bless my family. No, the Bible says that we have to watch and pray. Nehemiah specifically identified that, yes, you have to pray, but then set a watch. Identify those things in your family that need to be fixed. And start to work on those families. Call them out. Sometimes we want these problems to just be fixed on their own without putting any kind of effort into it on our own whatsoever. And this past week, right before the week for our family got started, Oda and I, we actually wrote down for the course of our week, 7 days, we wrote out a different topic that we wanted to identify in our family to pray for. So Sunday was one thing, Monday was another thing, Tuesday was another thing. Now, these weren't like major sinful problems that our family is struggling with, but we identified each one of our kids. Each one of our kids got a day. The future of our kids got a day. The salvation of our kids got a day. All of these different things got a specific day where every day, now yes, we prayed about overarching ideas, But every day we said, you know what? This could be, my son Leo could one day be the man that Satan directs his attention to and tries to destroy, tries to undercut. So do you know what I did? I set a watch over Leo on one of the days this week. And I said, this day I'm going to devote to praying for my son, because one day he's going to be walking out of my house, and I know Satan's going to be out there waiting for him. And he's going to leave the protection of the walls of my city, and he's going to walk out, and I know that he's going to be confronted with different problems. And so I identified Leo as one of the potential problems in my wall. I identified Noah. I identified Roman. And I prayed for each one of them one day a week. Now, I know we're done with our family week, but I think you can still do the same thing. Identify the point in your wall that Satan might come through, and begin to devote each one of those things as a potential problem. Set a watch, pray over them, fast over them. These things will not be forgotten before God. They will not be forgotten. Now, the other thing that caught my attention, if we scroll down to verses 12 and 13. I'll go in verse 13. Nehemiah chapter 4, 13. So in the lowest terms of the space behind the walls, in the open spaces, I stationed people by their families with their sword, their spears, and their bows. Notice, the men obviously had the brunt of the responsibility of building up the wall. And I think there's an amazing parallel here about the importance of a man in the family. But notice that the families weren't just along for the ride. It said that he stationed the people by their families with their swords, with their spears, and with their bows. Nehemiah said, men, grab your swords. You're going to be building. You're going to be watching over this wall. But guess what? Families, line up right behind them. You also grab a sword. You also grab a spear. You also grab a bow. Because guess what? The protection of this particular family depends on me and my family. So every time you decide that, listen, my family isn't in the right spot, declare a fast. You, personally, declare a fast. But bring your family into it. Tell your kids, listen, today, Leo, we are fasting for you. Do you know why? Because one day you're going to leave my house. One day you're going to have to make a decision to follow Jesus. And I had this conversation with Leo. And Leo's like, but Dad, I believe God already. I already prayed. I want him to be a part of my life. I'm like, yeah, Leo, I understand that. But right now you're living in my family. You're under I make you come to church. I bring you. And one day you're going to have a choice. And I was like, Leo, one day when you're like 14, 15 years old, you're going to have this question in your mind. You're going to say, do I believe everything my dad told me, or do I not believe it? And guess what, Leo? There are some people in life that say, I don't believe it. And they walk away from church and they never come back. And Leo got really sad because Leo's really sensitive. But I started to pray over Leo because I want him at that particular crossroads in his life. He started, I want him to make that decision. I want him to make the right decision. So I set a guard over each one of my kids. And I encourage you guys to do the same thing for this week when we start to pray about church and the health of our church. But also just don't forget about your families and your own personal things that you want to bring before God. Nehemiah set the men along with the families. He devoted the men and the families to stand guard. And they were able to be protected, because in verse 15 it says, when our enemies heard that it was known to us that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. God revealed Sanballat's secret plan, the enemy in secret. God revealed his secret plan to Nehemiah. Nehemiah protected him, his city. He protected his walls. He declared watches, and Sanballat was turned away. That was not wasted effort. Everything that Nehemiah had done, when he identified those problems, when he called them out before God, when he devoted the people to stand guard, that actually came to pass. And he was protected. We need to identify our issues. We need to look around at the walls of our family. Where is the weakest point in our family? And begin to fast and pray and devote that attention to those parts of the wall. And again, family isn't just within, somebody who shares my last name. It could be our church family too, or your friends if they need help. And I really appreciate. I forget who actually posted on just this past week on the church chat. Some random family that I've never heard of, but said, hey, listen, this is a family that we should pray for because they're struggling with a form of cancer. That's what we're here for. We as a family identifying a particular issue and then beginning to lift that family and that particular individual before God. That's what we're here for. Identifying those problems because God will take note. I want to go to a second example, and this is the story of Esther. And Esther, over the last couple days, Nehemiah too. Nehemiah and Esther just kind of became alive to me. Because what's interesting to note is that Nehemiah, even though Nehemiah in our Bibles comes before Esther, actually Esther lived before Nehemiah. And I'll tell you why that's an important piece. So Esther actually lived before Nehemiah, and we are introduced to Esther early on, but we're really introduced to the king first. And Ahasuerus, I think that's how you pronounce his name, as he's said or written about in the Bible, it also goes by the name of Xerxes. Okay, he also is by the name of Xerxes. For those of you that are history buffs or have ever heard of the story, he is the king of Persia. He is a Persian who went to Greece and fought against the Spartans. Do you guys remember the 300? Okay, this is that king, which to me was a complete mind blow. This is the guy who led his forces against the Spartans, against those 300. Okay. This is the king who's on the throne at the time when Vashti refuses to come out. He's the one who says she needs to be removed. And a couple years later, historians say about 4 years later or so, is when Esther becomes his queen. That's the king who Esther becomes the queen of. But we have this really interesting example that Esther is a nobody. She's a nobody. She has no claim to fame. She is an orphan child who her parents were also exiles, just like Nehemiah. But remember, Nehemiah comes later, approximately, I would say, about 15 years later or so. She has no parents. She's being raised by her uncle, or her cousin, who's about 15 years older than her, by the name of Mordecai, who plays a pretty important role. And while we don't have an author to the book of Esther, whoever this author is, it could have been Mordecai, maybe it was even Nehemiah, it's hard to tell. But whoever this author was knew the details. They knew the details. And so here is Esther, who just seems, at random, is chosen to be a part of this beauty contest. And we know the story well. The historian Josephus says that there was approximately 400 girls that Esther was a part of one of 400. Okay? The odds were not great. I once applied to a job that had 500 applicants, and I did not get it. It's really hard. Out of 500, a lot of really good people are going to submit their applications. And Esther was kind of applying for a job here. She was chosen, forced into a year of looking nice. So all of you girls, next time your husbands say, hey, you got to hurry up, just remind them, Esther took a year. I'm just kidding. But it's true. She took a year to get herself ready. And Alex will not be in church for the next year. So we have this example where Esther comes to the king, and for some reason, this extremely powerful king catches his attention, and she becomes his queen. And when we think about how the story carries out, there's once again, similar to how Sanballat became kind of this enemy in secret who was trying to undercut Nehemiah and what he was doing. Here we have a man by the name of Haman. And Haman is introduced to us, and he's described as, this is Esther chapter 3, verse 1. Esther chapter 3, verse 1. And after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set him on a throne above all the officials who were before him. Haman the Agagite. Haman the Agagite. Kind of an interesting way to describe somebody, right? And typically in the Bible, we have these different descriptions, right? I think last time I mentioned about Bathsheba, the son of the daughter of, I forget the name of the dad, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, right? The Bible very frequently gives us a name, but also gives us some kind of either a father or some kind of an important person back in history. Lineage was so important. Now, who was Agag? So he's described as Haman the Agagite. To really understand the story, I want to flip back to 1 Samuel chapter 15. And I just want to very quickly kind of go through a short story here that you're once again familiar with. Remember when Saul becomes king, King Saul becomes king. One of the first tasks that he was given was to go and destroy the Amalekites. Samuel says, listen, Saul, you have to go and destroy the Amalekites. Why? Well, the Amalekites, when the people of Israel were coming out of Egypt and they're walking through the desert, the Amalekites would come up behind and they would destroy the people. They would destroy the people. And so God tells the Amalekites, I'm going to come after you. You're going to get it. For what you did to my people, you're going to suffer. You're going to get it because my people were walking past. You kept harassing them. You kept going after them. You're going to get it. 350 years goes by. 350 years goes by. Samuel comes to Saul and says, Saul, now's the time. Go get the Amalekites. Destroy absolutely everything. Now, when I keep going back to this point, God of the Old Testament a lot of times comes across as being a very instantaneous, punishing God. 350 years, God let the Amalekites live on. And then finally, enough was enough. God said, Saul, now's your time. Go take care of the Amalekites, like I promised that I was going to. He says, you have to destroy absolutely everything. Saul goes, and he does destroy them, except who does he spare? Let's take a look at verse 9. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 9. But Saul spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, and the fattened calves and the lambs, and all that was good, and he would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless he devoted to destruction. He killed everything and destroyed everything that wasn't good. Only the good stuff, and the king, happened to be King Agag, he let live. Samuel comes in and says, wait a second, what's this guy doing here? Saul's like, well, you know, this and that. Samuel's like, bring him here. And Agag, as he's coming to Samuel, even kind of laughs a little bit. He's like, oh, you know, the king spared me. Who's this guy? Who's this old man he's not going to do anything to me? And in verse 33, we realize what Samuel has to do. Verse 32, Samuel said, bring me Agag, the king of the Ammonites. And Agag came to him cheerfully. Agag said, surely the bitterness of death is past. And Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord. Samuel, just absolutely brutal. Absolutely brutal. Now, let's fast forward. Years later, again, approximately, according to my calculations, probably about another 300 years or so goes by. Here's Esther, a Jew who hasn't revealed anything to her king. Has this enemy in the camp, Haman the Agagite. He is a descendant of this king Agag. How much you want to bet that Haman remembered? Because this was probably a story that was passed on from generation to generation. Do you remember what that Jew Samuel did to your father, King Agag? He hacked him to pieces after he had surrendered. How dare he, right? And for years and years, the story lived on. But guess what? Mordecai is also a Jew. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Mordecai was also of the lineage, and he may have even been of the lineage from Samuel. From Samuel and the lineage of the prophets. But don't hold me to that. So here we have this meeting of these two individuals. Mordecai, representing the Jews, and here we have Haman. Now Haman was this important figure, set on a throne above every other official. And of all people that doesn't bow to him, it's Mordecai. Why doesn't Mordecai bow down? How could Mordecai bow down to a man who's a descendant of a king that should have been destroyed? A descendant of the Amalekites who tormented the people of Israel. Haman walks past. Mordecai stands. People notice. Haman walks past again. Everybody bows. Mordecai stands. Everybody notices. After a while, Haman can't take this anymore. I'm not going to go after just Mordecai. I'm going to go after Mordecai and all the Jews. I'm going to hurt Mordecai so badly that it's going to be him and all of his people. I'm going to take them all down. And so he begins to plot against the Jews. Now, The issue is, we know the story, the issue is given out on a particular day that all the Jews are going to be allowed to be devoted to destruction. And Mordecai realizes what's about to happen, comes to King Esther. And this is in chapter 4. Comes to Queen Esther and begins to tell her, wait a second. Look at where you're at. You need to go to the king and plead on your behalf. And this is what he says. We're going to start in, this is chapter 4, verse 8. And Mordecai gave him a copy, this is to a servant, gave him a copy of the written decree issued to Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king and beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and he told Esther what Mordecai had said. And then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai. All of the king's servants and people of the king's province know that if any man, this is what Esther responds, they know that if any man or woman goes to the king besides the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come to the king for these 30 days. The first response for Esther is what? Esther says, wait a second, but I might die. I might die. Now, what's interesting is that Esther had lost a little bit of perspective. She's a Jew. There's a death warrant for every Jew. She would get that death sentence at some point in time. Not only her, but all of her people. And she's not seeing that. She's so focused on her inner position, on her inner safety, that she says, wait a second, I can't go, because if I go uninvited, the king hasn't even called for me for 30 days, and this is an extremely powerful king. If he doesn't call for me for 30 days, how am I supposed to go and talk to him? And this is Mordecai's response. And they told this to Mordecai, what Esther said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to her, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than any other Jew. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Mordecai is saying, a savior will come to God's people from somewhere. God wants it to come from you. But if you choose to sit back and worry about your own safety, you will die. Somebody else is going to be given the responsibility and the privilege to save his people. Salvation will still happen. I love the faith of Mordecai. Staring a death sentence right in the face and saying, salvation will come. I will be saved. All of these people out there, they will be saved too. You're going to die. Everybody else that's left in your family is going to die. But salvation will come. Salvation will come. And then he brings these words, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. He's saying, Esther, realize where you're at. Of all the people that could have possibly become this massive, this amazing kings, ridiculously powerful king, anyone who could have become a queen, it was you, a little Jew, has no parents, raised by some cousin. Who are you? And you ended up on this amazingly high throne. How dare you not see the picture? Destruction for all of the people, and you are sitting right next to the king. How dare you try to protect yourself at this time? You are born for such a time as this. This is the whole reason why you were born the way you were, why you're as beautiful as you are, why you're this particular king's queen. It's for such a time as this. This is your time. What are you going to do? Are you going to stand up and take care of this? Or are you going to let somebody else stand up and rescue the people? Because salvation will come. Salvation will come. Is it going to come from you? And I can just imagine the words, the fire with which Mordecai said, this is your time. What are you going to do? Because she's trying to save herself. And so often in our families, we look for salvation to come from somebody else. Salvation, there's destruction coming at our families. One kid goes down. The second kid goes down. My marriage is suffering. And I'm looking, somebody help me. Somebody help me. God says, this is your time. I put you in your family. You are married to your wife or your husband. I gave you those kids. You live in that house for such a time as this. We have to be the kind of people like Mordecai saying, this is your time to rise up. Declare war on whoever else is coming at you and say, me and my family, that's who I'm going to protect. That's who I'm going to fight for. We have to be like Nehemiah who say, listen, yes, my wall is only half up, but I'm going to stand guard. I'm going to start to identify problems in my family, declare war on them, and fight off anything that comes across those walls. And if I'm going to be like Esther, I'm going to stop looking just at my own problems, at what I think is good for me. And I'm going to stop looking around at somebody else to come in and save my family, because guess what? Your family is your responsibility. God put you in your family for a reason. And God will never test you beyond what you can bear. The problems that you are going through your family, maybe they're because of something you did. Maybe you got yourself into some problem. Maybe your husband or your wife got yourself into themselves in some problem. And maybe there is problems as a result of that. But guess what? That's your family. You have to stand up for your family. Because salvation will come. But it might not come from you. People will be saved. But they might not be saved from you. Don't wait for somebody else to step up. Mordecai said, listen, you might suffer. If you choose to save yourself at this moment, you and your family will suffer. Sometimes we put our hands down and we sit back and wait. And destruction absolutely destroys families. Whole families get wiped out. Because husbands, mothers, wives don't do anything. They keep waiting and waiting and waiting. Meanwhile, the call to you is, it's your responsibility. You stand up and you start to declare what things need to be fixed. And you go do something about it. And so what does Esther do? Those words changed Esther's perspective. The very next verse, verse 15. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews that are found in Susa. Hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night and day. And I and my young women will fast also. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai went away, and he did everything that Esther told him. Those words changed Esther's perspective. I hope they change your perspective too. And I remember there was a point in time when Leah was born, and we had some complications, and there was a point in time when Ola had to go into surgery to give birth. And I remember the very first time Leo just started breathing on his own, and the nurse picks him up and she hands him right to me. And I'm holding this kid who's like blue, crying, and at that point I realized that there is nobody that I could then take and pass him off to. At that moment, I am the top dog, so to speak. The buck stops here. I am the top of the pyramid. There is literally nobody else that I can hand him off to. I have a huge family. I have 10 siblings that are younger than me. And at any point in time, a kid was sick, crying too hard, I could have been like, hey, mom and dad, I'm done. Or here, older sibling, take the kid away from me. But suddenly with Leo, there was nobody else. I was the last stop. If he was screaming and couldn't stop, guess who had to figure it out? Me. That was a scary realization. And I think we have to come to that realization in the health, the spiritual health and well-being of our families too. There is nobody above you. There's no other family member. There's no other person outside of your family that carries more responsibility for the health and well-being of your family than you. And Esther realized that, and she says, listen, we need to go into a fast. We need to make sure that we are the kind of people who start to call out to God. And guess what? The whole plot of Haman turned completely on his head. Not only did Haman lose his own life, but then the whole plot against the Jews was come to an end. Now, I told you in the very beginning, and I'm going to close on this, is that Esther comes before Nehemiah. So we know that Nehemiah came to a king by the name of Artaxerxes and requested to go to Jerusalem. And the king, for some reason, was very sympathetic to Nehemiah, to the Jews, and he let him go. Well, now I want you to remember, Esther came before Nehemiah. They actually their lives probably intersected for a period of time. But here we have an interesting perspective here. Esther fought on behalf of her people. She won over the heart of this man who was who conquered territories and massive armies. And she managed to convince this king, of all kings, she managed to convince this king to protect her people. Years later, Xerxes is off the throne. Esther, we don't know how long she was a queen or what, but Xerxes had a son, Artaxerxes. He was probably not Esther's son, although there might be, we don't know. He probably wasn't Esther's son, but he was the stepson of Esther. Because I'm sure Xerxes, Esther's husband, probably had other wives. If he hadn't called her for 30 days, chances are he had other wives. Not uncommon for kings. So chances are Esther's husband probably had kids with other wives. One of those was Artaxerxes. Once Xerxes is killed, his son comes to the throne. His son, Artaxerxes, becomes the king to whom Nehemiah brings wine. And it's that king, when Nehemiah brings him the wine, the king notices, hey, Nehemiah, what's wrong? And he says, listen, my people are destroyed. They're exiles. My city is destroyed. Can I go back and help out my people? And there had to be something. He knew the history of Esther. There had to be something where he said, you know what? There was a queen who's also a Jew. She saved her people. This guy's trying to help his people. You can go. Not only that, but I'm going to send more stuff with you. The legacy of Esther goes beyond just saving her people in this one book. It lives into Nehemiah. Not only did she save her people, she also helped rebuild the city. Her legacy lived on. Our legacy also lives on. Beyond just what you do in your life, what happens in the lives of your kids goes on. 10, 20, 15, 30 years later, the walls of Jerusalem are rising up. And one of the people that needs to be credited for that is Queen Esther. Because she stood up at a time when her life was on the line. She came to God and said, you know what, I need your help. And God, through a miraculous event, saved her people, and then used that to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. I'd like to invite you guys to pray. And let's pray that God helps us to, first of all, like Nehemiah, identify problems in the city wall, in the walls of our family. Identify those problems and bring those to God. And second, to take on that responsibility, like Esther did, on behalf of our families, not to look for saviors from anybody else, but to realize that this is me. This is my family. And I live in this family. I'm a parent in this family. I'm a child in this family for such a time as this. Amen.